Welcome to the Ernie Chambers Show.
Brothers, sisters, friends, enemies, and fools. There are some fools out there, just like there are some of the others in that catalog. What I'm going to do is go back in history, not far, but just to show that a leopard does not change its spots, that the Jewish state does not change its viciousness, and that history can seem to be cyclical, like a cycle, repeat itself. And when somebody engages in a certain type of conduct or practice a certain activity, it becomes what is called a habit. And Israel has had a habit of attacking its neighbors, not because Israel, the Jewish state, is that powerful, but because they have a big brother who is really a flunky, the United States, which has more kill power than any country on the face of the earth, with the possible exception of Russia, and soon North Korea in certain areas may equal them. But those three countries, either one, two of them, or all of them together, could unleash a firestorm, a nuclear cloud, radioactivity that theoretically could lead to the eradication of human beings. But that is not exactly what I intend to talk about. I want to talk about Israel. When I was younger and went to church, the Jews were considered God's chosen people. That's what I had been told. As I began to read the Bible, read some of the horrible things that the Jews did, how God condemned them, how Jesus condemned them. Jesus even said, "Which of the prophets have you all not persecuted?" But that is not precisely what I'm going to talk about. I wrote articles during the long ago. The ones that I'm going to read from today come from the year 2003. If this is 2024, and I believe that it is, 3 from 24 is 21. This that I'm going to read from was written 21 years ago, and it could have come from yesterday or today's paper. But I'm going to start with an article that appeared in today's paper, the Omaha World Herald. Headline says, "Lawmakers question U.S. support." Austin tells Congress Israel is taking steps to boost aid to Gaza. I had touched on the fact, and national news and local have talked about the fact that there was a food convoy, and one of the groups had their vehicles marked with the emblem on top of the vehicles so they could be seen from the air. There would not be any, quote, mistakes, unquote, by Israeli bombers, and they could get this aid delivered to the people who need it so desperately. Famine, starvation, attendant sicknesses, and some diseases are racking Gaza, thanks to God's chosen people based on the way they describe themselves. But the Bible said there are gods many, there are lords many. So their God could be the devil. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. You'll know a tree by the fruit it bears. I'm going to get to this article, and it was accompanied by a photograph, and you probably can't make it out, but just let you see that there was a picture accompanying this, and the caption says, "Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Charles Brown Jr., testified Tuesday, which would have been yesterday, before the Senate Armed Services Committee on Capitol Hill in Washington. These men have all kind of badges and symbols to show their military exploits, but there were some questions. Austin tells Congress Israel is taking steps to boost aid to Gaza. This is from an Associated Press release which the World Herald printed. Washington. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin told the Congress Tuesday that pressure on Israel to improve the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza appears to be working, but he said more must be done, and it remains to be seen if the improvement will continue. Quote, "It clearly had an effect. We have seen changes in behavior, and we have seen more humanitarian assistance being pushed into Gaza," unquote, Austin said in a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing. Quote, "Hopefully that trend will continue," unquote. All America has to do is tell Israel what to do, and it will be done. But when you slide away from what you ought to do, the one that you're dealing with will see you as a slip and a slider and will take as much leeway as you give. Continuing, protesters interrupted the session several times by shouting at Austin to stop sending weapons to Israel. Quote, "Stop the genocide," unquote, they said, as they lifted their hands, stained in red, in the air. A number of senators also decried the civilian casualties, saying the administration needs to do more to press Israel to protect the Gaza Strip's population of 2.3 million people. Many are not just hungry. They're facing starvation, and famine is waiting in the wings. Austin said he spoke with his Israeli counterpart, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, on Monday, and that he repeated U.S. insistence that Israel must move civilians out of combat zones in Gaza and properly care for them. There shouldn't be any combat zones in Gaza. When you have over 3 million people in that small amount of land, there is no way that you can drop 2,000-pound bombs, use artillery, tank fire without killing civilians, because civilians are everywhere. It would be like this represents Gaza, and the people from this area where the attack started continued to move in this direction until they're all clustered down here. And when bombs are dropped and this heavy artillery is used, there is no way that anything can happen other than the killing of large numbers of civilians. The Jews know it, and they intend to do it. That which is foreseeable under the law is intended. Israel intends to kill civilians. Not only did they learn well from the Nazis, they are excelling what the Nazis did. Austin and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Charles Brown Jr. testified on Capitol Hill about the Pentagon's $850 billion budget for 2025. But the hearing offered the first chance for lawmakers on both sides to question the Pentagon's top civilian and military leadership on the administration's Israeli strategy following the Israeli military's deadly strike on World Central Kitchen humanitarian aid workers in Gaza. And they knew what they were doing. There were, I think, about 7 vehicles. They were spaced many yards apart so that it would be clear that this was a convoy. The markings made it clear, even to those in the air, that this was a humanitarian effort. The Jews cannot say that the attacking of that convoy and killing of those people was an accident because of the large amount of space between each vehicle, and each one was struck in succession. This was intentional. It was murder. It violated the laws, the principles of war and international law. But since Israel is a client of the United States, who is going to put Israel into the dock and make them stand trial for the crimes that they committed, are committing, and have made it clear they intend to continue committing? Let what they are doing to these Palestinians be done to them. And they cannot say, the Jews cannot say, Hitler did worse things to them. Not so. Let me find my place. But the hearing offered the first chance for lawmakers on both sides to question the Pentagon's top civilian and military leadership on the administration's Israel strategy following the Israeli military's deadly strike on World Central Kitchen humanitarian aid workers in Gaza. That strike also led to a shift in tone from President Joe Biden on how Israel must protect civilian life in Gaza, and drove dozens of House Democrats, including former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, to call on Biden to halt weapons transfers to Israel. Half the population of Gaza is starving and on the brink of famine due to Israel's blockades. Israel in recent days took initial steps to increase the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. In a call Friday, Biden told Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that future U.S. support for the war in Gaza depends on Israel taking more action to protect civilians and aid workers. Bull. There doesn't need to be a war in Gaza. There is not a war. There is a massacre. Netanyahu knows that Bush, they all run together in my mind, knows that Biden is a paper tiger. His bark, which is worse than his bite because he has no teeth. And Biden has said he'll continue sending these bombs, the missiles, the artillery to Israel, and the only thing they're going to be used for is to kill Palestinians. This is like something that may never have been witnessed in history on this scale. And it's under the auspices of what is supposed to be the most enlightened country on the face of the earth. And if America fits that description, or that description fits America, the earth and its people are in awfully bad shape. At the hearing, Austin also said the military is moving ahead with plans to build a pier off the Gaza coast to increase the delivery of humanitarian aid. Here is the big United States, and they've got to get Israel's permission to do anything. And now Israel is about to pull the trigger, perhaps on the beginning of a world war, by attacking a consulate where they knew Iranian diplomats would be, and there were some deaths. So Israel is provoking something because they know that they pop their finger and the boot-licking United States will come running. This is from an article that I put in the Omaha Star 21 years ago. March 27th, 2003. US/UK/Israel axis, international outlawry. UK stands for United Kingdom, Britain, England, Scotland, Ireland, and all the other little things that are part of it. Under Bush unilateralism, the world is less safe, personal security is less, confidence in the future is less. Outlawry is defiance of the law. In this case, the US/UK/Israel axis is in defiance of the UN Charter and international law. By spitting in the face of the international community pursuant to its national security strategy, unilateralism, the United States isolates and brands itself a rogue nation. For example, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld personifies U.S. arrogance and nose-thumbing by insulting France and Germany dismissively as old Europe, for refusing to mindlessly obey U.S. dictates, to behave as stupidly as George Bush and the claque of racist white men and Zionist Jews surrounding him. NATO and the UN have been contemptuously dismissed as irrelevant for the same reason. When the UN goes along with U.S. wishes, it is the world's greatest organization whose integrity commands respect. However, when the UN Security Council, mindful of the UN Charter, international law, and the interests of their respective nations, disagrees with the U.S. American officials, angrily then holler, the UN is irrelevant. The casualties so far of U.S. unilateralism are Iraq, the UN, United States, Europe relations, Arab regimes cooperating with the Axis. An expected outgrowth is the destabilization of the world and the unleashing of intensified terrorist activity around the globe. The rage, indignation, and contempt spawned by the murderous, cowardly, criminal aggression of the US-UK-Israeli axis against the people of bleeding Iraq, whom Bushites hypocritically intone have suffered enough under Saddam Hussein. They are so intense, I scarcely trust myself to write rationally about it. Listening to the ongoing U.S. propaganda line echoed by the subservient U.S. media relative to the purported justification of the illegal aggression serves only to make matters worse. Clearly, the U.S. is a rogue, killer nation, thumbing its nose at international law and the world community. Notwithstanding Bush's preposterous claim that the invasion, and this is about Iraq, that night they attacked Iraq with the bombers. Let me find my place. Bush's preposterous claim that the invasion is to, quote, disarm Iraq, free the Iraqi people, and save the world from terrorism, unquote. Liar, liar, pants on fire. First, no weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, or nuclear, have been shown to exist, thereby exposing the disarmed sham as a lie. Second, even the CIA has found no evidence that Iraq has been trained, has bred, trained, or exported terrorists. So, the terrorism lie is run to earth. No legitimate U.S. national interests are advanced by the invasion and conquest of Iraq. What then is the driving motivation behind the illegal aggression against Iraq? It is hydra-headed, meaning several heads. Hydra was that kind of monster from Greek mythology. Number one, the Bush family's personal vendetta against Saddam Hussein. He supposedly said somebody ought to kill Bush's father, and that caused the family to hate Saddam Hussein, and for that he and the Iraqi people had to suffer. Two, the lust of Bush's cronies for Iraq's oil. Three, bowing to Israel's demand for a U.S. military foothold in Iraq from which to attack Israel's designated enemies in the Middle East. And 4, unilateral adventurism and imperialistic aggression. Unremitting nighttime aerial bombardments. If you watched television at that time, the screen would be dark, you'd hear the planes roar, then you'd see all this fiery appearance along the horizon. That was the shock and awe. Unremitting nighttime aerial bombardments and missile attacks that are intended to and do sow terror among the Iraqi populace are not the behavior of, quote, liberators, unquote. Thousands of bombs and missiles with accompanying horrendous explosions, terrifying concussive effects, resulting fires, fumes, smoke, and fouling and contamination of the atmosphere can hardly be deemed liberation. It is doubtful that Iraqis feel better about their women and children being slaughtered by so-called liberators from the U.S. and U.K. rather than at the hand of Saddam Hussein, which they could never prove that Saddam was doing. The terror, destruction, and nerve-shattering noise and chaos being wreaked by the axis of outlawry are unmatched by anything previously inflicted on Iraq and its people. And when one nation preemptively unleashes unprecedented military might against another that is far weaker and poses no imminent threat, it is not war, but vicious bullying. It is the slaughtering of innocents. How many women, children, infants, elderly, and infirm will be murdered by Axis forces in the air, on the sea, and on the ground? Killing civilian non-combatants is murder. Killing Iraqi civilians is intentional. Both moral and civil law declare that what is foreseeable is intended. Killing civilians is foreseeable. Who doubts that the bullying U.S. behemoth will ultimately crush militarily tiny and weak Iraq? Still, questions remain. Number 1, what will be the reaction of ground forces when, despite shows of overwhelming kill power, significant resistance is encountered as the invaders near Baghdad? And may the spirit of jihad draw outside support to Iraq's aid? 2, having been convinced of their invulnerability and invincibility by Axis propaganda, what will be the reaction of the young troops, and how will they behave when they come face to face with the reality that they and their comrades, not only Iraqis, will be harvested by the Grim Reaper? Will the, quote, psychological warfare, unquote, of the Axis trumpeting guaranteed death to Iraqis and guaranteed victory to Axis forces backfire when death cuts a swath through the invaders' ranks, as it surely shall? 4, what will be the ramifications and complications of the movement of Turkish troops into Kurdish North Iraq in disregard of wishes and warnings of the U.S. and in the face of Kurdish vows to fire on such troops? The slam-dunk invasion of Iraq may not be quite as neatly packaged and ready for delivery as the American public has been led to believe by official U.S. and media propaganda. Americans may shed as many tears over the death of their loved ones in this illegal bush war of aggression as tears shed by weeping Iraqis over the death of their loved ones. In the meantime, Bush and his advisors enjoy the safe, snug comfort of their safe houses and the dinners and other social diversions available to the elites who cheerfully send other people's children to their death in an unworthy cause. Shocking as it may seem, Iraqi David may have a special stone to slay U.S. Goliath. This gloomy discussion calls to mind a song titled, "There's Got to Be a Morning After," and a reminder, the rest of the world cannot be disregarded in the aftermath of the Axis outlawry in Iraq, as has been the case where the only question devolved on the irresponsible and criminal wielding of overwhelming kill power by the Axis powers, killing untold numbers of civilians, elderly, men, women, children, infants. Long ago, an English gentleman named Oliver Cromwell made a plea to the Scots before the Battle of Dunbar. Quote, "I beseech you, in the bowels of Christ, think it possible that you may be mistaken, because the Scots were going to fight England." The scoffing Scots paid no heed and were crushed in the ensuing Battle of Dunbar, September 3rd, 1650. If only somebody could prevail on Bush to apply Cromwell's cautionary plea to himself as he blunders and plunges into the thicket of arrogant, irresponsible military unilateralism. The reason I'm going back is to show that what's happening today is just a part of the thread that reaches back some distance. Not quite so long ago, Otto von Bismarck became the first chancellor of the modern German Empire. I like history. Malcolm X said history is the subject best suited to reward our study. He was the modern German Empire, 1871 to 1890. He has been memorialized with an adjective, Bismarckian, and that does not refer to the jelly donuts that we call Bismarcks. Bismarckian, which signifies aggressiveness in politics and diplomacy, is what Bismarckian meant. He won 3 wars and unified Germany, but his legacy, pursued by his successors, that Germany should be unmindful of the interests of every nation except Germany, led to 2 colossal defeats. Thus, the Bismarckian aggressiveness that united Germany and engendered an aggressive national spirit united the world against his successors and resulted in devastating defeats. People need to think about the consequences of their actions. Will the Bushites take heed? Today, weak Iraq. Tomorrow, who's next? With a little bit of luck, Bushian unilateralism may succeed spectacularly for a time, but when it falls in the long run, the failure will be catastrophic and terrible. Even now, bitter, sometimes violent protests around the world and in the U.S. against the Bush family's war and unilateralism are harbingers of more ominous things to come. With little consideration given to long-term consequences of that policy based solely on using the nation's overwhelming kill power to vindicate a family feud and Israel's aspirations in the Middle East, Bush has taken a fateful step which cannot be retracted. The die, as they say, is cast. I repeat, Bismarck won 3 wars that unified Germany, but left a legacy of aggression that led to 2 monumental defeats. I used to have a cable program through Fox and Cox, and the mayor and another fellow who used to work for KETV didn't like me and what I said, so they took the program off. This occurred March 17th of 2003. Last night, March 17th, they had talked about this policy of America called shock and awe. Following are some of my thoughts prior to the raining down of bombs and missiles on the people of Iraq. The U.S. shock and awe threat wilted into aw shucks. Last night, which was March 17th, 2003, I watched President Bush talk to the nation from a red-carpeted corridor in the White House. His expression resembled that of a deer in headlights. His weasel eyes had a staring, glittering aspect that made him appear to be either on drugs or lost in that fanatical fog of religious zealots. He has said God talks to him and tells him what to do. Such a delusion creates a dangerous, deadly combination when joined to U.S. kill power. Bush billed his speech, quote, the moment of truth. Instead, it was a quarter of an hour of platitudes, mental mush, foolish fanaticism, and nonsense that a speechwriter put together to cast Bush in the role of a messiah, a savior. As I watched that speech, it struck me as the most bizarre public spectacle I ever had witnessed. It was sheer madness. It was more like a parody, a caricature produced by Saturday Night Live than a real president with the power to destabilize the entire world. But there stood old Weasel Eye in the flesh, engaging in a towering bit of nonsense. He fell into the mode of old Western movies. Gunfight at the OK Corral, Gunsmoke, High Noon, John Wayne, Doc Holliday, John Wesley Hardin, Billy the Kid, the Dalton brothers, Jesse James, all rolled into one in his tortured little brain. Narrowing his beady weasel eyes into a hard squint, he peered into the camera and delivered the statement calculated to fix his place in history. Quote, Saddam, get out of town in 48 hours or I'm going to get you. And that goes for your kids too, unquote. This is you all's president. The rest of the world is shaking their head in amazement. A fool is abroad in the land. The U.S. is in the hands of a buffoonish madman. That speech convinced me that Bush is indeed suffering from messianic, they might say messianic, but the delusions of being a messiah. He truly believes himself to be the Messiah. Again, peering into the camera, he said, as if talking directly to the Iraqi people, as if they were watching him on TV instead of preparing to dodge U.S. bombs and missiles, your suffering is at an end. Your deliverance is at hand, unquote. So Jesus-like, in the part of his vacant mind that may be operational, he probably saw himself wrapped in a robe like Jesus, wore sporting sandals, and saving the world while bringing death, carnage, and destruction. Messiah Bush will intone, quote, America is here to save you from a tyrant. Be of good cheer. Am I supposed to say I approve of everything America does because I live on the same continent on which they live? Just because they're called Americans, am I supposed to approve of and support everything they do? That is insane. America is the nation of sheep. Whatever Bush decides in his disordered mind to do, America will fall in line behind him and go along. Well, I am not a sheep. American troops slaughtering innocents in Iraq commit murder, a crime against humanity. Why are they doing it? Why are they using deadlier super weapons in numbers dreamed of never before? Paraphrasing Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, even though it involves killing civilians, because they are following orders. Yet Bush said in his speech about Iraq soldiers who might employ certain types of lethal weapons against American troops, quote, "We will not accept the excuse that you were following orders," unquote. Quote, "Following orders is justification for whatever depredations American invaders commit against Iraqi civilians, but not for Iraqi soldiers defending against U.S. troops murdering civilians. Move over Nazis." Iraq, victim, U.S. aggressor. Iraq is not wrong in this confrontation, but the U.S. aggressor is. There is no justification for what the U.S. intends to do to Iraq. Iraq is no threat whatsoever to the U.S. Iraq can do nothing to hurt the U.S. Iraq has no means to attack the U.S. and never has expressed the intent to do so anyway. Iraq cannot menace the U.S.'s survival. Under principles of what is called a just war, no basis exists for the U.S. to attack Iraq. An attack is unlawful aggression, pure and simple, in violation of the laws of war. The only reason Bush and his ilk will not be tried as war criminals is because of U.S. kill power. The victor always is the prosecutor and the judge. The vanquished, the ones who lose, always are the ones in the dock standing trial, and ultimately many of them executed by hanging. At some point, the cup of America's wicked oppression will be filled to the brim. When forced to drain it, America will sing a different tune. After September 11th, 2001, the U.S. declared war on terrorism, as they called it, and the whole world was expected to join. Nations throughout the world identified with the U.S., expressed sorrow, and extended condolences. It was an era of good feeling toward the U.S. America was in a position to manifest some statesmanship, some maturity as a nation, and could have unified the world by showing respect and consideration for other nations, and could thereby have provided leadership. America could have enjoyed its most shining hours. But no, prideful, short-sighted, arrogance, and inconsiderateness asserted themselves. The good feeling extended toward America was squandered. It evaporated. Sweetness turned to vinegar. U.S. officials began to insult the countries that were its traditional allies, lecturing them as if they were children. Quote, "If you don't do as we direct, you're on the side of the terrorists," unquote. "If you are not for us, you're against us. If you don't vote for a resolution authorizing force against Iraq, you're voting in favor of Saddam Hussein and his evil." Old Europe scoffed at the adolescent attempt at child psychology. Their stance against America's foolhardiness was not a vote for Saddam. It was a vote against stupidity and unilateralism, against destabilizing and inflaming the Middle East. It was against upsetting the decades of fragile political balance in the world. Predictably, they were branded irrelevant. Will Bush think it possible that he may be mistaken? Let us see what the end shall be. Obviously, I don't like to read, I'd rather talk. But I want to get some things into the record. Israeli tail wags American dog. This was written and published in Omaha Star, July 27, 2006. The destructive, murderous, criminal assault by Israeli military forces against the innocent people of Lebanon, women, children, elderly, and infirm, is wholeheartedly backed and sponsored by the U.S., whose own hands are stained with Iraqi blood. The great Satan as America is known in the Middle East, just expedited a shipment of bombs, missiles, and other high-tech weaponry to its Israeli client for use against Lebanese civilians in a state-executed war of terror and mayhem against civilians. Isn't that what Israel is doing now? War crimes are perpetrated daily by Israelis against virtually unarmed people. The rabid Israeli tail, obviously, is wagging the complicit U.S. dog. And Iran has been handed a blood-drenched demonstration of why it had better develop the means, including nuclear, to defend and protect its people against Israel and its U.S. adventurism. I'm convinced that the murderous behavior of the U.S.-Israeli axis of terrorism is what provoked Russia within the past few days to back away from support of the U.S. proposed sanctions against Iran and to reevaluate the entire Iran nuclear question. And Iran did develop nuclear weapons thanks to what Israel was threatening and what America was backing them up in. But without reading all of this, because I got a lot, and I'm going to read some later on, my intent was to show, and I had listed concrete examples of things that happened all those years ago being duplicated by the Israelis today. They had different, I was going to say chancellors. Germany has chancellors, and their most notorious regime was that of the Nazis. Israel has had different prime ministers, Sharon and some of the others, and some of them were as vicious in their own way as the Nazis had been toward Jews, Eastern Europeans, gypsies, and Russian prisoners when they were taken captive. And some of the Russian prisoners were shot down in broad daylight in the streets. For some reason, the Israelis really hated them. You thought I made a mistake, didn't you? The Nazis had the Russian prisoners and shot them down in front of the German populace, and other things were done by Hitler which made it impossible for the German populace to say, when the Nazi regime was obliterated, that they didn't know what was going on. They didn't know there were concentration camps. They did not know that there were extermination camps. They didn't know that that stench that rose from these giant, I call them incinerators, were caused by the burning of human flesh. People who watch evil being done to others and don't take a stand against it, even by speaking against it, will find all kind of rationalizations that will enable them to say, I didn't know what was going on. When they saw the Germans transporting truckloads and train loads of Jews somewhere, and the Jews never came back, and what were called rumors were flying everywhere, and survivors of Jewish families who managed not to be home when everybody else was taken, and they had gotten information about what was happening and were trying to spread the word, there were people who still said, we don't know. We didn't know. And when the Germans made anybody who was Jewish take a 6-pointed star, a Star of David, put the letter J on it and wear it prominently, the German people didn't know what that was about. And when this old man was talking to this little boy, and a car went by and it had curtains over the windows, the little boy said, "Who's in that car?" And the old man said, "A man is in that car who said he talked to a person who saw and talked to Hitler." It was almost as though Hitler didn't exist. There was a point that I'm unable to make by reading this, by saying what I'm saying, no matter what, because people have their minds made up on what direction they're going to go. The point is that we should not sit by and watch other people mistreated and abused when we can say something, when we can do something to prevent it. If white people see rogue cops messing over black people, poor people, Latinos, they should say something. I read an article about this Latina woman who had a $10 million bond put on her because they said she provoked a fight between two men, and her bond was several hundred times the bond of the man who actually committed the killing during the fight. Nobody talked to me about it. Nobody asked me to do anything, but my sense of outrage was such that I filed a complaint against the judge who set that bond, insisted that it be lowered, and they did lower it. Not miraculously. When you're learning something, they say learn the ABCs. I reverse that to the CBAs. If you have an idea that's worthwhile, conceive it, C. Believe it, B. Achieve it. That's CBA rather than ABC. And all things come to an end. And my time here today is coming to an end. I must acknowledge that I did not get into the items I wanted to read. As I was reading, my mind was racing to other things that I would rather say, but I had promised to read. And as Abraham Lincoln said, the promise being made must be kept. Some people watching may rather have had me talk, explain, give my arguments than read from articles that were written. But the purpose of that was to show that what the Jewish state is doing now, they had done decades ago. They had done it down through the years to their neighbors, thanks to the backing of the great Satan, the United States. Israel couldn't do this on its own. They don't produce bombs. They don't manufacture airplanes or munitions. They get them from America. And everybody sees Joe Biden as a pussyfooting, mealy-mouthed, scaredy cat. He says Israel better not kill these civilians, yet they're going to continue shipping billions of dollars in military aid to Israel. As I mentioned earlier, 2,000-pound bombs dropped in civilian areas. And Joe Biden is a president that people ought to have confidence in. Somebody's got a ring in Joe Biden's nose attached to a cord, which is in somebody's hand, and when they jerk that cord, Biden moves in that direction, and that hand is Jewish. He's like Charlie McCarthy sitting on the lap of Edgar Bergen. The puppeteer makes the puppet move. The ventriloquist is the one who speaks. The puppet, the dummy, the mouth moves, but the words are those of the ventriloquist. Israel is the ventriloquist. They allow Biden to say whatever he wants to say. But then when they tell him, when Biden tells Netanyahu, you better not do this, Netanyahu shakes her finger and says, you better remember who you're talking to. So you tone that down. But whatever you do, don't make the threat to withhold aid of a military nature. There are people on both sides of the aisle, as they say in Congress, Democrats, Republicans, in the House and in the Senate, who don't want aid of a military nature to go to Israel. But Biden, being the pussyfooter that he is going to send that aid. If there were elections in Israel right now, I believe Netanyahu would lose. So he doesn't want elections. He is under criminal charges right now in Israel for influence peddling and other misuses of office. This so-called war, which is really a slaughter, is a God-sent, a Jehovah-sent rescue for him. He wants to keep the killing going to divert attention from what he has done. If elections occurred, I say again, he would lose. Israelis are conducting demonstrations. Tens of thousands of people, it looks like, are in the streets. There are Israeli hostages that are claimed to be in the hands of Hamas. The relatives of those people are crying out saying, we want our relatives. Others, we want our friends. Others, we want our countrymen to be released. And we don't like this killing of civilians in the name of Zionism, in the name of Judaism. I am not one who will say that the Jews are getting what they deserve, because not all Jews are involved in what is happening. The ones who are responsible are the ones who drop the bombs, who pull the triggers, who do the killing. But because human beings tend to generalize and lump together, you'll hear that expression, the Jews, as though it's one entity. And I say again, if you have a Jewish friend, keep that person as your friend as long as he or she has done nothing to break the friendship. But don't fault that person for what's happening at the hands of the Israeli government. That person may be more opposed to it than some people in this country because they know it is a reflection on them and everything they believe in. And they wish that such a thing were not so. I don't know how much time I may have, but I'm going to presume that I've said enough, and a wise man knows when the time has come to maintain silence. So with that, I'll say au revoir.
You've been watching The Ernie Chambers Show. If you'd like to leave suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This is an EWC Communications production.